What do you mean 1, 2, 3? No, everyone knows it's 1, 2, 7, 4, 5, 6, 3, 8, 9. That's how you... Hold on, I'm in the middle of something. Hey everybody, this is Jonathan. Welcome to episode 7 of Hell If We Know. You may have already noticed that this is not episode 3 from when I said it's episode 7 just now. That's because the topic of this episode is something that's relevant to what we discuss in a lot of episodes. So I wanted to go ahead and drop this one a little bit early and let it be some background information as we continue with the series. So, you know, that's that. Enjoy it.
I've finally jumped onto the hype train of Game of Thrones. Well, not entirely.
Oh no.
I know. So I watched the first episode like 3 times in previous years just trying to get into it, and I never could. Just because... I think I've said this before, maybe even on the show, but I don't like shows or movies where everybody's really dirty looking all the time.
Oh yeah, you mentioned
like the reason I don't like Pirates of the Caribbean is because I don't like looking at greasy haired, like unwashed faces for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And it's the same. I have the same feeling for Game of Thrones. But last night I finally gave it another chance. I watched the first episode for the 4th time, and I was like, all right, maybe I can get into this. And now I have watched the first 3 episodes, and I'm intrigued. I wouldn't say I'm like hooked yet, but I'm intrigued to see what happens next.
Yeah, so you're definitely gonna keep watching.
I'm gonna keep watching.
Which means eventually you probably will get hooked.
And yeah, that's what I'm. I don't know about hoping for, but that's
Right.
what I anticipate is gonna happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of specifically why I don't watch it. Like, I don't hate it or anything. It's the same for me as, like, with Breaking Bad. Is like, both of these shows are, like, shows that everyone is crazy about and think is so great. And it's like, because I've been able to watch a few episodes and not immediately get hooked, I don't want to watch more episodes and then have to devote all this time to, like, finishing the series for either one of those.
Right. Well, did you finish Breaking Bad?
No, I only watched, I think, like, the first 4 or 5 episodes. And it was like a fine show, but I was lucky enough not to love it so much that I felt like I had to continue.
Right. Yeah, the thing for me with Breaking Bad was that I watched, like, the very first scene in the first episode. I was like, whoa, what the hell is happening? And I was hooked from the first scene, and I couldn't stop watching after that. But I guess in that first scene, it kind of, like, immediately throws you into the action and gives you, like, a question of, whoa, what is happening? I have to find out. And Game of Thrones did that too, but with a bunch of dirty, unshowered people. And so it took 3 times watching the first episode for me to finally say, all right, I'll let these boys take a shower later. Let's see let's see their story they have to tell.
That's very generous of you. Yeah. I almost have like the opposite thing as you had with Breaking Bad. More like what you had with Game of Thrones. The first time I tried to watch Lord of the Rings when I was like 7.
Oh, yeah, I don't like Lord of the Rings.
Well, I like it now, but for sure, like when I was like a little 7-year-old boy and when it first came out, like the first one, it like the very first scene is this giant fight scene with a bunch of like disgusting orcs and everything. And little 7-year-old boy Jonathan was not the big rugged man Jonathan that you see before you. And like I was like disgusted and terrified, and like I left immediately. And then like 5 years later, I watched the whole series and I was like, oh.
I've tried several times also to get into Lord of the Rings. Google Play was giving out one of the movies one time for free, and so I downloaded that. And I've also downloaded the audiobook of the first book for free. And I've tried to give both the old college try, but they are just so boring, and they're so long. Like, if they were only half as long, maybe I could just chug through the boring part and get to the exciting parts. But as it is, there's just so much boring going on that it's sad.
I think part of it is because, like, I spend so much time, like, in my church crowd. Because especially in, like, moderately conservative Christians love to make that tie-in between Tolkien and, like, theology and whatever. Or at least in the PCA and, like, my home church. And I seem to get that vibe across lots of denominations and stuff.
Wait, what is it about Tolkien's literature that has to do with church?
I don't know. There's, like, that's one of the things is, like, some pastors just want everything to seem hip. And it's partially that they want everything to seem hip. Not that Lord of the Rings is even hip, but, like, you know what I mean? It's partially that they want to be cool.
Yeah.
And partially because they literally are just so, like, amped up about this that they see it and everything. Because it's like how, you know, there's, like, 7 stories that exist or whatever. So, like, the Christ story is one of those stories. So when you like, watch Lord of the Rings or when you read any book, you can basically say, if you're looking for it. You can be like, and here's how we see the redemption of Christ and his resurrection and blah, 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 you know.
Right. I think, like you said, there's 7 stories. I would even say there's less than that. And definitely the main story that's told in since the beginning of time is just the classic hero's journey. And I would definitely say you could find that in the Bible and in, well, of course, Lord of the Rings, because there's heroes and villains and bad boys. And
I would say the one, I mean, I can't deny the whole, like, there are only 7 types of stories thing, but I want to because I don't like it. There's the way that people interpret that I don't like, because then people will say, like, oh, there's only 7 types of stories. Once you've heard one, you've heard them all. Like, it's almost like an excuse to dismiss certain stories.
Right, to never read another story again.
Exactly. But the thing is, like, the format they're talking about is so vague, and it leaves so much room for infinite amount of creativity that it really doesn't, like, to say there are 7 types of stories doesn't really mean anything. It's just like advice for writers to say, like, here's a trope you can use that will always work, you know? It doesn't actually limit any kind of anything. And so I don't like looking at it that way. But I remember the first time I read the Sam and Fuzzy comics, I was so blown away by the amount of creativity in there. I was like, oh, this is a new story. There's no way this is one of the 7. And it totally is.
Sam and Fuzzy? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, it's not like a big thing. My brother, so you know how much I love Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, right?
Yeah, I love that movie too.
Yeah, for sure. So when my brother found out I loved that same Christmas, he got me the original comic books, or graphic novels, I guess. And so I really enjoyed those too. And then, like, the next Christmas, my brother got me these graphic novels called Sam and Fuzzy, which was based off, like, an online comic strip that just evolved over, like, the course of a decade and became this really intricate story. But yeah, they're really cool, and they're probably the most creative thing I've ever read. And, you know, there's obviously more room to be creative, in a sense, with the graphic novel, because then you're also illustrating everything and you're, like, designing these entire worlds rather than just letting the reader do the creativity for you to a degree.
Right.
So, I mean, I was just blown away constantly by, like, the character design and the plot and the loopholes, and just everything about it was brilliant, I thought. And so when I first read it, I was...
Sam and Fuzzy?
Yep. Yeah.
That sounds like a Calvin and Hobbes knockoff.
I mean, it is, like, a human thing and a less human thing.
Right. And Hobbes is fuzzy.
Exactly.
I was thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really creative. But I remember the first time I started reading those, I was like, this has got to be the one. This is the new story. It's the 8th story. But it's not.
Here's a question along those lines.
Okay.
What do you think the best story is with a female lead?
Ooh, I feel like
movie,
I thought
TV
of this
show,
the other day.
book.
Yeah. Oh man, I actually think I had an idea for this the other day, and now I can't remember. Do you have one?
I do. It's 100% for me, Mulan.
Yeah, Mulan is really good.
Mulan, I think, it's the best and most underrated Disney movie, I think.
Oh no, for sure, most underrated is The Lost City of Atlantis.
Oh no, that movie sucked.
No! Oh my God!
It wasn't good.
Get off my podcast.
I will say,
that is the best movie. And Kida, everybody listen to this. Kida deserves to be canonized as an official Disney princess because she is the best one. She has all the attributes of the other princesses, plus more ones.
I'll be honest. I'll be honest. I haven't seen this movie since I was 5. I didn't like it when I was 5, and so I don't like it now.
Well, when you get back stateside, we'll watch that one together.
Okay, deal.
Yeah. So we haven't talked about Fuji on the podcast, I don't think.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to tell the listeners about that a little bit? Because that was super dope to hear.
Yeah, so, it was so cool. So I went to Mount Fuji, which is the tallest mountain and a still active volcano in Japan, and it was the coolest experience of my entire life, hands down, bar none, period, end of story. The mountain is almost 4,000 meters tall, which is like 12,500 feet tall. It took 2 full days to climb and then like 1 full day to descend. So the first day we hiked from like noon until 6:30 or 7 p.m. and then we ate some dinner at like this little hut at the top, near the top of Mount Fuji, and then we went to bed. And we woke up at 2 a.m. to finish the hike so that we could summit the mountain during sunrise at like 4:30 a.m. And man, it was the coolest freaking thing in the entire world. I watched the sun rise beneath me. Like, I was taller than the sun was. I was above the clouds. Like, I was looking on the other side of clouds. Like, when you look up from the ground, you see the bottoms of clouds, but I was looking at the top of clouds, man, and I wasn't even in an airplane. It was so cool. And I met some cool people there, and we all just like basked in the ambiance of the beauty of nature, and it was quite a cool experience.
That's super cool, man.
It's gnarly, bro.
Yeah. All right. Well, since we're having some technical difficulties and we are FaceTiming instead of Skyping, I'm a little concerned with my phone battery. So I'm gonna suggest we.
Did you not bring a cord with you?
I did, but it's pretty short, and all the outlets are way on the ground, so that would be awkward.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm gonna suggest we just go ahead, dive into our subject matter for the day. If that's cool with you, Chris.
Sure.
All right. So we're gonna look at Genesis chapter 1, which already I know some of you are saying, Jonathan, we already did that. But specifically, we're going to look at chapter 1, verse 27, and just that. And it says, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." And that is what we're talking about today.
Ooh, that one sentence, that's going to be the theme of our podcast?
Yeah, that's our theme. We're talking about the good old Imago Dei, as the Latin-speaking people would say.
Okay, and would you like to tell us what that means, or are you just going to act pretentious?
Yes, both of those. The Imago Dei is just Latin for image of God. So that's our big topic. It's come up a lot in previous episodes, particularly when I'm trying to explain what I think about things. When I try to describe the way I interpret passages and how we should treat one another, for me the image of God always comes up, because it's a very important part of my theology. It's a cornerstone of what I think is essential to Christian doctrine. So I didn't prepare anything, which I should have, because this is possibly going to be a pretty deep episode. So we're excited about that. But yeah, I think it's an important one to get at early so that it's a reference for all the other times I'm certain to bring it up.
Yeah, so I think the biggest question that I have, and that I think I've even posed in previous episodes, but you've been like, oh, wait, hold on, like, we'll talk about it in the episode about image of God, is when it says God created man in his image, and woman, man and woman in his image, I think everybody has it in their mind that he means physical image, which is a bipedal, ape-like organism with eyes on the front of their head and a nose in the middle and a mouth below that and ears on the side. And, like, is that what is meant by image of God, or is it meant like morally in his image, and like what does that mean? Yeah,
that's a good question. And we will probably be that'll be the question for the rest of the episode. So I'm going to talk about some other ways of looking at it before I get into just what I think personally.
Okay.
I don't think that is what I think this is the E author, if I'm not mistaken. The one who refers to God as Elohim. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that this author intended it to be that. I don't think he intended it to be that we literally look like God, that God looks like us. So I think originally that's probably what he intended, is that it has to do more with our morality, with our humanity, and what separates us from the rest of creation. Because if you look at that story up till that point, it says God created light, God created the sky, the water, whatever, etc. But none of that is really specified. It just says God created this, and it came up, and it was good. But here we've got this instance of God created it, and then certain Bibles will have this in different ways, and this is probably not how he originally wrote it, but it becomes its own paragraph that's centered in the middle of the column in a lot of ways. So it's isolated. It's meant to be separate, according to most scholars apparently, from the rest of the text as a very important message. This one verse that says we were created in God's image. So it's the main thing I think he intended, according to how scholars have put it since then, is it's just supposed to be how we're separated from the rest of creation. So that's like the big thing, I think, that like traditionally.
But separated how?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it's almost like trying to explain something that they notice rather than to describe something that they're introducing. Do you know what I mean? So I think he's the author of this is looking at creation and saying there's something about humans. We have this capacity to think, we have this sentience and this self-awareness, and it's something that the rest of creation doesn't seem to have. And so I think he called that the image of God, because I think he saw that as godliness in a sense, God being this ultimate self-aware being.
So a certain sentience and a certain way that we look at the world in comparison to other animals.
Yeah, but I think it's more of an effect rather than a cause. When the original audience was reading this, I don't think it was supposed to be like oh wow, this is a cool new thought. I think it was more of like that makes sense because obviously we are different from creation. You know what I mean?
And my rebuttal to that would be, but are we? Because I kind of feel like we are just animals called humans, and we just happen to win in the climb up the evolution tree, and now we can talk and make iPhones and things like that. Whereas like, who's like the next smartest animal? I don't know.
I think like a parrot.
Yeah.
Did you ever watch the show? Yeah. Oh yeah, I think it was crows. Did you ever watch the show on Animal Planet? The Animal Planet's Most Extreme. Did you ever watch? No. I loved that show.
No, I didn't have cable most growing up, so I couldn't watch that.
But yeah, no, let me tell you about this show real quick. Because, for one thing, it was just the best show ever, period.
It was the most extreme show ever.
Well, absolutely, at first. That's the thing. It's because it was a countdown of... They just pick some adjective, and they do the countdown of the most that adjective animals in nature.
Okay. So like most colorful or most fastest or something.
Right. So yeah, a lot of the first episodes were like most dangerous, most lived in a difficult environment. I don't know. They picked a better word than that. But like things like that are actually like, wow, this is a crazy example. I didn't know animals could do this. But the thing is, I don't think they planned ahead very well, because that was like the first season, and then the second season, or however long the show was, they started, like, every episode was less exciting.
Oh, man.
So, like, they'd get to animals, they'd do, like, they started with, like, the strongest, the fastest. Then it'd be, like, the smartest. And, like, that's cool, but it's not visually entertaining necessarily. And then they got to ones that are, like, have the strongest sense of smell and, like, stuff like that.
Oh, man. Yeah, they definitely ran out of content ideas, like, real quick.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think I watched that show a lot, and I want to say, to answer your question, I want to say it is a crow. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, because I've seen videos of crows like solving puzzles, and not even like puzzles that your average like 3-year-old kid couldn't solve. Puzzles where you have to like put a coin in a box and then turn a lever and open a door, and then you go into this little like glass cage and you have to, I don't know, flap 3 times and dance around and like do some, I don't know. Yeah, but you've seen videos of crows do some like pretty amazing stuff, and you're just like, why do you, like the dumbest freaking animal of all time, why do you get to be so smart?
Yeah, but you know about the there was this psychological experiment done back when there were no rules about how you could do experiments in psychology.
Dude, I miss those days.
I know, they were so fascinating. Actually, I also watched this documentary. Well, it wasn't a documentary, but it was sort of like, it was like a biopic, I guess, of the not Zapruder, that was when JFK got shot. Zimmerman. Zimbardo.
Yeah, Stanford Prison Experiment.
Yeah, exactly. They did a movie about that.
Oh,
it's
it was
super
so good.
Yeah,
dude,
man.
IMDb gave it like a 6 or something like that, but it was so good. It was
yeah, no,
so good.
I wasn't. Literally, when I learned about that experiment in my psych class, I was like, oh, this is messed up, but I'm not interested in this. But like watching the movie of it, I mean, like, I guess I'm sure they exaggerated some things, but I think the point of it was that it didn't need to be exaggerated. Like, that's how it was.
Right.
So that blew my mind to watch that. But what I was gonna say is another psychological experiment from that era was they tested the parts of your brain that reward you, like the pleasure bits, all the dopamine bits and everything. Mm-hmm. And they hooked up a little like probe to a rat's brain, so it connected to that. And when he pushed a certain lever, it would activate it so that he'd be like all happy. And they found out that this rat, once it figured out that it pushed that button and it would be happy, it just kept pushing that button until it died.
Oh,
like they would give it food and they'd give it little lady rats to have sex with, and it would ignore all of that and just keep pushing the button until it starved to death.
Yeah, I know that experiment. Are you sure it was a little thing that like hit its dopamine receptors? Because this may be a different experiment, but I heard it was they gave the rat like a teeny little bit of heroin.
Oh.
This may be a different experiment, but it was the same result where they gave the rat a little bit of heroin if he pressed a lever or something. Yeah. And at first he was like, oh, this is pretty cool, like heroin's dope. And then, but he would still continue eating like banging lady rats and stuff like that. But yeah, eventually he just got so addicted to pressing this lever for his heroin injection that he forgave all food and all sex and other things that a rat might want to do in its life. Okay, only food and sex, that's all they want to do. But
yeah.
But you're right, he died because he was too into heroin. And so I guess their point with that experiment was like, see, heroin's bad. But like,
you got us.
Thanks for that confirmation.
Yeah. So the point of all that to say, humans are so smart that we figure out our own ways to get heroin. You know, we can do the little 3-year-old crow puzzles when we're 3 years old. You know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what he is observing there, that separation of intelligence, and more specifically self-awareness. Like, have you seen, there's also videos on the internet of, like, if you place, like, giant mirror in the jungle, all the gorillas lose their minds and start, like, banging on it and freaking out and getting super confused. And, like, there are some,
I've
like...
never heard of that. That's so exciting, though. I'd love to do that.
It's actually really cool. There's, like, I think there was one point where, like, a bird flew into it, which, like, doesn't even make sense, because even if you don't know it's a mirror and you think it's another bird, get out of the way. But
or
anyway.
maybe he tried, but like the image kept moving with him. What if
he went like, straight into it.
He was like dive bombing that other bird.
He really was.
Wanted him dead.
Yeah, but yeah. So and there are some animals, like there's also videos where you can see like dogs slowly starting to realize like, oh, this is me in the mirror. But that's few and far between. Like generally, this recognition of yourself as an entity. And this ability to metacognate and understand like your own thoughts to a degree, that seems to be distinctly human. And I think that's what he was getting at when he said, okay, we're different from creation, and I'm going to call this the image of God. So I think that's the original message there, as far as I could guess.
Then I guess what my biggest hang up is then why did he use the word image? Because to me the word image is strictly visual. Well, at least it's mostly visual. And so when I think, image of God, obviously we don't know what God looks like, but we know what humans look like, and so we can guess that if we were made in his image, then God looks pretty much like us, which would make sense that why all these Renaissance paintings of like God in the clouds and like touching David's hand and things like that, it would make sense why he just looks like an old man,
right,
with long flowing gray hair.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing is a lot of times people will say, actually, I think there was some poet or some theologian from back in the day who made the comments like, oh, when we do this, we run the risk of creating God in our image. The little turn of phrase there. Which I think, like, it's become a little bit cliche in some circles.
Sounds Westworldian.
Yeah, I think they do reference that in Westworld. But yeah, it's a good point to say that we create God in our image. Like, even just looking at it as the idea of like, okay, having these literal images where we paint God and God looks like an old white dude. Mm-hmm. There's obviously that, but the implication of that and what causes us to do that is actually a lot more important and more problematic than that, because it makes us feel so self-important, Like, there's all these portraits of white Jesus that came from the Renaissance, and ever since then, because of this European idea of like, this is what a savior looks like, this is what a hero looks like, and then comparing that across other cultures where it's like, oh, that doesn't look like us. If the ultimate savior of humanity, if the deity which we are supposed to worship looks like this other person who doesn't look like us, that's problematic. And that's another thing is, if we create God in our image, whose image is that? Because humanity doesn't look the same as one another. Like you said, we are bipedal, we have all these eyes and whatever. But
all these eyes.
Both of them, man. I guess the sum of our eyes. But yeah, it's you can't say that that's one image necessarily, because we've got all these shapes and sizes and genders and ethnicities and etc. If we look at it specifically as a visual image, it can't even make sense. We can't look at it as a visual image without creating God in our image, and specifically one group of people's image, or even one individual's image.
Yeah, I was going to say individual specifically, because when one person is thinking about, well, what does God look like? Then you run the risk of projecting your image onto God's face and body. So, like, right. I mean, I don't think God looks like me. I don't think he's, like, skinny and, like, 6 foot tall, but and he's probably at least 7 foot.
At least 7 years old.
He's at least 7. Scholars are still, the jury's still out on this one, but scholars tend to agree that he's been at least 7 for at least 2,000 years.
Yeah, the whole young Earth theory.
Well, so I'm also interested in how, I know this isn't really our bread and butter, but I'm also interested in how other religions, how they view God. For example, I know in Islam, Muhammad isn't their God. It's Allah, who is probably the same, I think you've said this even before, who's probably the same God that we worship.
Yeah.
because they both aren't, like, on the religion tree, didn't they both kind of derive from the same seed?
Yeah, that's why it's called, like, if you talk about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and Baha'i, although they get neglected a lot, they're called, like, the Abrahamic faiths, because Abraham is, like,
Right.
It's his offspring where it started to split off. But we all came from that same, like, when you say the God of Abraham, that there's no way that doesn't mean all four of those religions, the God they worship.
Right. Well, I know in Islam, you're not allowed to draw Muhammad, but you're
Right.
also not allowed to draw Allah. And so I feel like they actually kind of have it right, because if you draw God, then you are drawing him at least somewhat in your image, at least in your brain's image of how he looks. And so just by saying, okay, nobody draw him,
Right.
then that allows you to form your own image of how he looks in your head, but then not share it with anybody, so that everybody kind of has a non-offensive view of how God looks in their head.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm with you. And that definitely does prevent, like, anyone from becoming too self-righteous, too. Because, no one's able to promote their own image of themselves as the image of God. So, yeah,
Right, it's not like Islam doesn't have a Michelangelo who just, like, did the best drawing of God, and so that's how we think of God now. Like, when I think of God, I think of Michelangelo's paintings of God, because he was just, like, the one who can draw God best. But I think if Islam, like they do, says that, like, you can't draw Allah, then, like, nobody's the best at not drawing Allah, so everybody can just think how they want in their head.
Yeah. No, I like that too.
Okay, so I think we even brought this up in the Genesis episode where we talked about where maybe the image of God first came up in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still not fully sold on the fact that Adam and Eve weren't, like, amoeba, and because I'm like a very strong believer in evolution, which is, the first organisms ever were tiny little single cellular bacteria of some sort. And why can't Adam and Eve be amoeba? And why can't God's image be these two little bacteria things? So, like, maybe God is just a giant bacteria in the sky. Or maybe he's a little bacteria under the ground. We don't know. So maybe God's image was who he created way back then, which looked nothing like us today.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Although I think part of my initial pushback on that almost puts the idea of, like, God being primitive, which I know is not what you're getting at, but, like, there's almost that inherent value associated with it, where we are more evolved than God was. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
So I don't think, if anything, I think God's some, like, ultimately evolved thing that goes beyond any idea of what humanity could ever become, because God is more evolved than our species will ever reach.
I don't know. I think amoeba had it made. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't even have to talk to other amoeba. They just had to cellular mitosis themselves into a second existence.
Yeah, which is nice, but I mean, like, where's the fulfillment? Where's the meaning in that? And I think God's, at least maybe this is, like, very, like, human-centric and, like, arrogant of me to say this. And maybe it even is me creating God in my image to say that, like, because humans seek meaning and fulfillment, that God is all about meaning and fulfillment, Maybe this is a false assumption where I say we seek God and we seek meaning and fulfillment, so those two must be intertwined. So that's why, like, in my mind, I can't conceive of God as being a little bacterium or a big bacterium, because that has no meaning or fulfillment within it. You know what I mean?
Well, maybe the bacteria's purpose was to divide and divide and divide and divide until it becomes generations and generations and millions of years down the road a functioning human like us, and then millions of years down the road we'll be superhumans and, like, half cyborgs. And so maybe the bacteria's purpose in life, his meaning in life, was to allow life on Earth to evolve into, millions of generations of more advanced organisms.
Yeah, but then what's the purpose of God today? Which is, like, I'm not saying there has to be one. That could be, like, a valid interpretation. But I don't think it's consistent with my understanding of God to say that God's purpose was to instigate the amoeba at the beginning of all life. I feel like God is still active in the world today in some kind of way. At least I hope so. That's one of the comforting things I like to lean on without fully being able to understand or describe it, is that God being active in the world today makes me feel good. So, maybe it's a defense mechanism, but that, for me, God can't just be that push at the beginning that got everything started. God has to be more than an amoeba, to me. But I like what you're saying, though. It is cool to think about.
Yeah, I mean, since we're on the topic of image of God, it's just, I just like to speculate as many images as I can about what he would actually look like. I mean, and I know I keep consistently taking the word image maybe too literally, but I'm just fascinated by like, what does this guy look like that I've been learning about for 23 years?
Right.
I would just want to put a face to the name, you know?
Yeah. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk about earlier. Is actually when I took one of my Christian Ed classes in college, one of our assignments we had one time was to draw an image of God across like how we perceive God in different phases of our life. So like when we were toddlers, when we were adolescent, and then I mean we were like 20, 19, and 20 at the time. So that was pretty much then. Those were the 3 stages.
Right.
And so like I was able to draw like the little like Michelangelo God for toddler stage. And then adolescent, I remember that was when I was really getting into stuff and getting involved with youth ministry and really trying to understand things on a more personal level. So I had this more like androgynous figure that was supposed to be like the father, and then there's like the spirit and the son sort of on thrones to the side. But then when I was trying to draw the image for like my 20-year-old self, every time like I started to make any mark on the paper, I'd be like, no, that's heresy. Or like, no, that's not quite theology, right? Like, anytime I would start to think like, oh, God could look like this, I'd be like, nope, for sure not, because blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that's...
Yeah, and if you draw him one way, then you're alienating a kind of person who looks another way, you know?
Exactly.
Like, the image of God I have in my head is, like I said, the Michelangelo version where he's a large, strong boy with gray hair and flowing, and he's got a little pecker. And he just looks like the hero in a story, you know. He looks muscular. He looks like he could beat up your dad.
Yeah.
And but that sort of alienates anybody who couldn't beat up my dad.
Right.
And there's people out there like that. So.
Oh, a few. Your dad. Yeah.
my dad versus God showdown.
So going back, let's talk about another interpretation. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about from that first stuff? We went all over the place, but yeah. So I wanted to say the next thing that comes to mind when I think about the image of God stuff is actually let's hold that for our third thing. Second thing, since you were talking about in other faith stuff, I want to talk about in Judaism. Actually, there was obviously they use the same passage in reference to the image of God as we do, but I remember one time this was something that blew my mind, partially because I disagree with it entirely. Not in practice, but strictly in like theological implications. But it was super fascinating to hear them talk about this. Is I went to this seminar thing one time that was put pronoun by these 2 rabbis.
No, preposition.
Oh jeez, man, I've been
you're embarrassing.
This is the worst night of my life, honestly. I've been so consistently bad at speaking right now. This is gonna be the worst episode. But anyway. I went to this preposition with these 2 rabbis. Sounds like the setup for a joke, but I swear it's not. To make it sound even more like the beginning of a joke, and probably an offensive joke, one of the rabbis was transgender. But this is just a real scenario, not a joke.
Does exist?
Yeah, no, it's pretty cool, right? But anyway, it's 2 rabbis. One of them's transgender. And they were talking about... It was the series of seminars was on, like, transgender lives in different religious contexts. And so they were talking about the Jewish context, obviously. And one thing they brought up was when you look at this original passage in Genesis 1, where it says, and God created them in his image, man and woman, he created them. There's almost a chronology there where it says God created them in his image, as if there's this one thing at first, or like this essence at first of humanity, and then creates man and woman. And for a long time, I think people have just looked at that, and to a degree, I still just look at that as like weird syntax, where it's like, yeah, this is in a frozen register with like some old, poorly translated English from Hebrew from whatever.
Yeah,
like,
I was gonna say that just sounds like something that's maybe lost in translation because different parts of sentences get flipped around so many times in so many different languages that.
Yeah, and
finish your point before I tell you it's wrong.
I just want to I just want to agree with your disclaimer there and say like for sure that's kind of what I look at it as too. But I thought this was still super fascinating, and so it promotes this idea of like God being almost like hermaphroditic and having both sexes. And that the original human being this thing before God split it into man and woman. So it was like God created humankind in God's image, and then God created man and woman. So that's the implication there. And then this is where it gets really crazy. It's not something that I agree with theologically, but I love the implications of it, and it's a cool story. So then if you go into Exodus, to back this up, there's this one bit where I think it's Moses, someone is like talking to God, and he's like, "Hey God, I want to look at you. Show me your glory," I think is the phrase he uses. And God's like...
God showed him his glory.
Well, that's the thing. God didn't even show him God's glory.
You said this was an Exodus, right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so God's like, "No, you can't handle that. You're not ready for this jelly." And I think it's Moses is like, "No, swear I'm ready for this jelly." And God's like, "Okay." And then God's like, "Okay, but here's how it's going to go down. You're going to have to hide behind this rock, okay? And there's a little crack in the rock, and you can peek at me through the rock, okay? And I'm going to walk by, and when I'm in front of you," it's really weird. It's so specific.
There's
like,
no way that this is the most convenient and efficient way. I would just rather not. I would rather keep speculating than go through all this trouble.
Well, then you're not a true believer, which you're not.
I guess not.
But it's a crazy story. So it gets even more ridiculous because God's like, "Okay, and here's how it's going to go down. You're going to have to peek through the crack in the rock, and I'm going to say when, because I'm going to walk by, and when you're looking at my front, you can't look. But when I walk by and you're looking at my back, I'm going to let you know, then you can look." So that's the setup. And so then Moses does it, and like Moses looks at God's butt and is like, "Wow." But the thing...
Wow, this is amazing.
Exactly, yeah. But the thing, I was going to make a pun of, it was his holy. Yeah.
Wait, so he literally only saw his... Or when you said walk by, I got the impression that Moses would see like a side profile of God, and probably his good side.
Right, exactly. But no, that's the... for something that has such specific instructions, what happened isn't clear. At least to me when I read it. I was like, this is such a weird passage and it makes no sense. But what they were saying at the seminar, at least, is that it seems to be...
I want to look this up, and we can... I want to add this in. Do you know what passage this is?
I want to say it's in Exodus 33, but I'm not positive.
Exodus 33, Moses sees God.
Yeah.
I'm going to type that in. While I'm searching, we can like edit this out, but I want to add this in.
Yeah.
The backside of God. That's the first thing that comes up.
Exactly, man. But yeah, so it's like, it's literally, the way they describe it, the rabbis described it, is that Moses saw God's backside because, and here's the implication, this was like a very... or the inference. This was, it seems like it's reaching to me, but the implication of it is cool. So they said this was because there was something going on in God's front that was too incomprehensible to Moses. So if you want to talk about tying it back to the Genesis passage where there's this image of God looking human that has both sexes and then is split into man and woman, and then this thing that this Old Testament guy couldn't bear to look at, that God says, "You're not ready for this." The implication that they're saying that is made there is that it's because this God that walked by Moses had balls and a vagina, and that Moses would have just lost his marbles if he saw that.
They didn't have like r/WTF like the Reddit at that time, so this would have been like the most incredible thing for somebody to see at the time.
Exactly.
Like I've seen my fair share of dead bodies and like weird things on the internet just by being a person who wastes time on the internet.
Right.
And if Moses didn't have that, then I'm sure somebody with balls and an envelope would have really messed him up.
Yeah, no. So that makes sense. I think that's also, there's like an episode of Family Guy where Stan is like becomes God, or doesn't become God, but he meets God. No, I think it's Family Guy. What's the name? Or no, American Dad. American Dad.
Oh, okay.
Isn't the son Stan in that?
I have barely watched that show. I think the dad's name is Stan.
Okay, well, whatever the son is, they're like in the Middle East, and the son meets God, and God presents God's self to him as Angelina Jolie, and so he goes back and he's like, "Look, here's how you can create peace. Is because God told me this and this and this and this." And then, like, it fades away, so you don't actually hear the magical thing that God said about how to create peace in the Middle East. But then eventually goes back to that scene, and they're like, "Wow, that was brilliant. Yeah, we're cool with each other now." And they're like, "So what did God look like?" And he was like, "Oh, God was so hot, he looked just like Angelina Jolie." And they're like, "Oh, we're gonna have to kill him now." And then they go back to being violent. But, like, it's that weird thing about, like, if God doesn't match your presupposition about what God should look like, then experiencing the image of God is almost too impossible for you to comprehend. According to these two rabbis that talked to me one time, and according to Seth MacFarlane, apparently.
That's super interesting. So we're looking at the passage that John just talked about, which is where Moses says to God, "Show me your glory," and he wants to see God's glory. Wink, wink.
Yeah.
And so that starts at Exodus 33:18. It says, "Then Moses said, 'Now show me your glory.' And the Lord said, 'I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you.'" Oh boy, this is just getting more exciting by the minute. "And will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, but I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. But," he said, "you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Ooh, this is like a sexy cop drama. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Right.
Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes, I will put you in a cleft on the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but not my face. It must not be seen."
Right.
Period, quotation marks.
That's right. So yeah, it's not even looking through a crack. God just peekaboos him.
Well, it says, "I will put you on a cleft in the rock." So isn't a cleft like a little crack?
Oh yeah, I guess so.
And then he also says, "You'll know it's me because I'll say, 'Hey, it's me, the Lord.'"
Oh yeah, that's right.
But like, he could have gotten God has access to a wide variety of humanity. I might say all. And so I feel like he could have just offered anybody like 10 shillings at the time, which I'm sure is the currency that they used, and I'm sure is the currency that God deals in.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he could have said something like, "I'll give you 10 shillings if you can walk by this rock and say, 'Hey, my name's the Lord,' and then walk away." And I'm sure anybody at the time would have said, "That's fine. You don't even have to see my face. You just have to see my backside in a long flowing white robe."
Well, yeah, it's the thing is it doesn't, at least according to the interpretation put forth by these rabbis, there was no robe. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
Like he saw his bare backside?
Yeah, because that's the thing is that like the theory that they're talking about is that the genitals were what would have baffled Moses and caused him to die.
Well, so wait, did God have a butt?
I guess.
But why doesn't it say that?
These are the important details.
If there's this whole passage about Moses seeing God, and then you're right, it's too careful of a plan with no outcome. It basically just says like, "And then Moses saw God."
Exactly.
But it doesn't say what that looked like. So screw you, Moses.
Yeah. Well, Moses didn't write this, but yeah.
Oh wow! And the very next, so that story ends, right?
Yeah.
And the very next thing that's said like in the Bible is the new stone tablets when Moses chisels laws on tablets. Right. Like, that's the very next thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
they
it goes from God to God making Moses tell people what to do.
Yeah. Yeah, the people who wrote the Bible clearly didn't know their demographic. Humanity is really interested in butts and descriptions of them. And you left out this great opportunity to really pull people in with a good holy butt description, or a butt-holy description.
Butt-holy description.
Yeah, that was an oversight for sure.
Well, so we were talking about the image of God, and now we're more interested in the image of God's butt than the image of God's face, which is what I was originally interested in.
Right. But, like, doesn't that make sense? To be interested in God's butt?
It does. It's a natural human inclination to want to know what people's butts look like. It's science. Exactly. Look it up. I think cats probably have it in the bag because every time a cat, well, dogs too. Every time dogs and cats meet each other for the first time, they're like, "Let me look at your butt to see if I like you. Let me, not only that, sure. Let me sniff your butt to see if I like you." What I'm saying here is that I think when God made animals in his image, I think dogs and cats were his image. Because God wants people to see his butt, and the only other animals that do that are cats and dogs, right?
Yeah. So you're going to go so far as to say that this is way mistranslated, that God created humans, and then God created animals in God's image, dogs and cats God created.
That's all I can get from this.
Yeah, I'm with you there. That does make a lot of sense. Going by the theology of the butt, that's pretty wise actually.
Theology of the butt. That's episode title right there.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Up till that point, I was going to say the image of God's butt, but that's too specific. That like almost reveals something about the episode, which I'm trying to avoid with most of the titles.
Right, we need to be a little clickbaity.
Exactly. So, theology of the butt. So, yeah, the idea there, what they were going for, though, the reason I love that story so much, even though there's like, it seems like it's a stretch to make these inferences about it, but the reason I love it is because it points to this idea of the image of God being so centered around equality of different genders, and even of non-binary genders, that God isn't a man, God isn't a woman, and that whether you're a man or a woman, or even if you were a man or you were a woman or you never were, but you understand now that you're not what people thought you were, whatever it is, God doesn't adhere to a gender system that we project on ourselves. So that's what I like about that story, even if it is, the implication is awesome and solid, but just getting to that point was difficult, I think.
I think when you're like a child and you're learning about God for the first time, I think it's helpful to call him he or she or whatever you want, but I think it's helpful to call him like one thing so that you have like a vision of him in your head. But then as you get older and you start to think about this stuff for yourself, I think it's also helpful to ditch that childish portrayal of him and start thinking for yourself what he might look like, if that even matters to you.
Yeah, because, I mean, like, even for me, like, I love talking about it, but I don't know if I would say that the image of God as a literal image matters to me at all. Because, honestly, if it did, I'd be really troubled theologically, because I can't begin to wrap my head around a specific image of God. So that would be a problem if it matters too much to me.
Agreed.
Yeah. But then also, you know, the idea of, like, obviously Bible uses the word he. So it's not even just like, sure, we have this creation story where it says God created humankind, man and woman, he created them. If you look at the very next creation story in Genesis 2, you've got this God that specifically creates Adam and creates Eve out of Adam's rib or whatever. And not only that, but you've got this anthropomorphized God, which is something that Jay, the Yahwist author, does a lot, where God walks among them in the garden. And so you almost have to have this physical
cop
image.
It's more like Undercover Boss, actually, like that TV show from years ago.
Right. But also just like theologically problematic, if you ask me. Like for me, the first mistake made in Scripture, if you go through it in the order it's written, is when Jay implies that God has this human form and is walking among them. And not because it's impossible for God to do that, but because the way humans read that doesn't work. It limits God. It puts God in a bubble and says, okay, so God has this human form, and God is this human form, more importantly.
His whole thing is that he transcends humanity, so he shouldn't take the shape or gender or skin color of a human.
Exactly. So yeah, I don't like that, but I see where people get it from, you know, obviously. There is the he language, and there is the anthropomorphized God that Jay puts out time and time again. But also, speaking of Jay, another point that I wanted to get at for image of God, so again, if you compare the E and the J creation stories, in E, obviously, but that's what we've been talking about this whole time, is he says, God created them, blah, blah, blah. In his image, he created them, whatever he says. But we've said it like 4 times, so I didn't want to say it correctly. I wanted to sound cool and kind of mumble through it like, yeah, you get the idea, I'm cool. But anyway, to me, there's a parallel passage in Jay's creation story where he breathes the breath of life into them. And that's what seems to separate them and give them this vitality. Where God breathes the breath of life into Adam and Eve? Yeah, because they don't mention that in the E story, and in the J story, they don't mention the image thing. So for me, like, part of what fuels my understanding of the image is when I tie these two passages together and compare them. Because especially if you look at the Hebrew word for breath of life, it's something like ruach,
Ruach.
R-U-A-C-H. So yeah, but that also means like spirit or wind or most importantly spirit. So ruach is the breath of life, and it is the spirit of God. So to say that God breathes this into us, this essence, this holiness, this spirituality into us, and that being something that separates humanity from everything else that's been created, I think I associate that also with the image of God.
So did other animals not get the ruah breathed into them?
Not according to what Jay tells us, at least. Although Jay leaves a lot more stuff kind of open-ended than he does with the creation story. Because in Jay's, it's like, when Jay opens up, there's already like a world and animals and things. Or I think there's animals, maybe there's not. I know that Jay's the one that tells Adam, or that gets God to tell Adam to name the animals. I can't remember if the animals existed before or after Adam. Anyway, so that's the parallel I draw, at least. Because it seems to be what separates the two. or separates humanity from creation in the two stories.
Okay, so I picture that then as like our sentience. Our sentience is the ruah that was breathed into us, and that's the reason why we have metacognition and we are aware that we exist. And cats are just like, I just want to sleep all day,
Right.
and look at butts.
Exactly. And I was going to say, this is also where a lot of the Christian and Jewish understanding of the soul comes from, because there's a lot of different ways you can interpret the existence of a soul. You can have the duality where like it's something separate entirely from your body. There's some people that would say it's like some aspect of your body somewhere hidden inside your brain or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know which one of those sides I lean more toward, because whenever I start to lean toward one, I'm like, oh, that really neglects this one aspect of the soul that I'm trying to understand and I don't want to forsake yet. But I think that's also intimately connected to the idea of the image of God and the breath of life, and that also being something that separates us from the rest of creation.
Yeah, it definitely could be the spirit that he injects into us or something like that. I dig that thought, that philosophy.
Cool. Yeah. But everything we've covered so far has been describing like this idea of what the image of God is, but not what that really means. Like, so, okay, we've got a spirit, or we're different from the rest of creation. So what? And that's, we've spent all this time on the part that doesn't even matter to me, and that I definitely, obviously don't even understand that well. But what I think really, I do have some sort of grip on, and what does really matter to me is the implication of that and what we do with that information, whether or not we understand it fully. So that's what I really want, even if it's going to be pretty short for time's sake. That's what I want the emphasis of this podcast, or this episode, to be, is the image of God and what we make of it, what we do with that.
And what do you do with the image of God once you have non-successfully chalked up what it is? Yeah.
I'll tell you what I do, or at least what I tell other people to do, because it's one of those do as I say, not as I do things, because, total depravity. But for me, if you look at the image of God, and you look at it as something embedded within every human, and an essential aspect of each human, then that means that anytime we dishonor another human, anytime we fail to love another human well, anytime we oppress any groups within humanity, which just a hypothetical thing there, but anytime that might happen.
Hypothetically, maybe. Right. I've heard it's happened in history, yeah.
But, low battery message. Cool, so we're definitely wrapping up. So I think the important thing there is that anytime you do this thing, you're not just being an that should be enough, try not to be but that's not even the whole thing. For me, there's a greater gravity to it, because what you're doing there is defaming the image of God. You are bringing dishonor to God and who God is by dishonoring that person. And that's present in the teaching of Jesus, wherever Jesus says, like, hey, you're gonna, kingdom of heaven, blah, 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 because you gave me a coat and you fed me. And everyone's like, no, we didn't give you a coat and feed you. But then Jesus is like, whatever you did to the least of these, when you saw the poor person who was shivering and you gave him a coat, and you saw the starving lady and you fed her, whenever you did that to the least of these, you did that to me. That's what the image of God really means to me, I think, is that not only do we see God in one another, but we need to love one another the way that we love God. And that's the purest form of worship, I think, is loving and serving one another.
Yeah, I think you've said that in maybe it was our Tower of Babel episode, but I think that's a perfect point, because you're right. I was so stuck on this what does God look like thing that I never even thought, okay, like once I have or haven't found what he looks like, hardly matters. What do I do with that information? And you're right. If you insult somebody, then you are by default insulting God, because God made all of us in his image. Physically, it doesn't matter, but God, there's a piece of God in all of us, is what you're saying, and is what the Bible perhaps is saying. And if you're insulting another person, then you're insulting a piece of God. And don't do that, you jerk. But
and I think one of the things that's even more recently been something cool that I've thought about more is not only is that how we worship God and how we love God through loving one another, but I think that's also one of the major ways we get to know God and we learn about who God is by witnessing that image of God in other people. So that's part of why I think the whole 2 or 3 gathered in my name thing, or the existence of congregations or groups of people, I think part of the real dignity of that, and the reason that's so important, is because as individuals, there's no way we can ever know God, because we only contain this one piece of God, a piece of the image of God, that we can't even really reflect fully to ourselves. But when we come around other people, we see the godliness that's in them, and we're able to reflect our image of God to them. They're able to reflect it to us. And the more diverse that group of people is, the more we're able to see these different aspects of who God is.
Humanity is a mosaic that when we come together, we paint the image of God all together.
Exactly. That's beautifully said. Anything else you want to say?
No, I like how we always have these questions that don't make sense, and then you're like, well, it's like this, and I'm like, okay, cool, that makes sense.
I will remind you that we spent like 90% of this episode saying like, oh, I don't have any clue about this. This doesn't make sense. It's just that's why I like to save the parts I get for the end, is because then it sounds better.
Right. No, it's a good wrap up. It's a good cherry on top.
Yeah. So I did want to close with a quote. But before we do that, I just want to say our usual closing information. I'm Jonathan. This is Chris. You can say that if you want.
This is Chris.
And you can follow us at HellifWeKnow on Instagram and Twitter. You can email us with any questions or corrections or suggestions you have with HellifWeKnowPodcast at gmail.com. We got a YouTube, we got a Facebook, etc. That's actually all of it, just those things. But yeah, so hit us up. We'd love to hear from you. And unless you've got any closing comments, Chris, other than thanks for listening. I forgot to say that too.
I don't think so. Hit me with the quote.
All right, this comes from, his name is written in tiny text, and I actually haven't read it up till now. I just really like the quote. But it comes from Thomas Merton, which I think that actually might be the name of one of those authors that Sister Tracy mentioned in her episode. But anyway, so Thomas Merton apparently is very cool. But here's the quote that I'm going to end on. To say that I am made in the image of God is to say that love is the reason for my existence, for God is love. Love is my true identity. Selflessness is my true self. Love is my true character. Love is my name.